Welcome to the Philosophemes channel. This is Season 1, Episode 6, in which we discuss the order and organization of Nietzsche's writings, otherwise known as Nietzsche's Canon. Okay, just a quick overview then of Nietzsche's Canon. One of the things I'm not trying to do here is I'm not trying to provide a biography of Nietzsche. Perhaps we'll do something like that down the road if we have more time, but for now, we're just looking at the order and organization of Nietzsche's writings. Okay, so we do see he's born in 1844, dies in 1900, of course, and then we can divide his writings up into three phases: the early phase, the middle phase, and the late phase. The early phase is characterized by the birth of tragedy and goes from the birth of tragedy to the first edition of The Joyful Quest. Lastly, the late phase occurs in 1888. Nietzsche was admitted into the insane asylum in January of 1889. So if we look at Nietzsche's earliest philosophical writings, there are a number of philological writings prior to the philosophical writings, but I'm not going to consider them here. So really, I'm just picking up with Nietzsche's writings starting in 1870. And in 1870, we see the Greek music drama, two essays, the Greek music drama and Socrates and Tragedy. So these, as you can see from the image here of Richard Wagner and Cosima Wagner, these essays were shared with the Wagners, and the Wagners were very enthusiastic about them. Both of the Wagners encouraged Nietzsche to continue to develop these essays and actually write a book. So Nietzsche started writing another essay, which was titled The Dionysian Worldview. And the Dionysian Worldview then becomes the beginning portion of his first book, which is The Birth of Tragedy. Nietzsche's writing of this essay was interrupted by his military service, and after he was injured, he actually found some time to spend on this essay. An early handwritten version of the Dionysian Worldview, and we want to make sure that we recognize that that word worldview in German is Weltanschauung. That's important for those who study Kant's use of Anschauung to refer to intuition. The Dionysian Worldview was sent, a handwritten version was sent to Cosima for Christmas in 1870 with the title The Birth of the Tragic Idea. So you can see that he's beginning to transform the title of this, but the idea is still the same. And of course, it becomes The Birth of Tragedy. And as I fully believe and as I argue in my second edition text of Full Throttle Heart, I believe that the Dionysian Worldview is in the background and is absolutely needed to unify and understand Nietzsche's work. So we want to remember that Dionysus is here in the beginning and never really goes away. Okay, so Nietzsche's early phase then, as far as the books go, begins with The Birth of Tragedy. We then see that Nietzsche begins a process of writing 13 essays. These essays have been variously translated, or this project is variously translated as Thoughts Out of Season, or Unconventional Observations, Untimely Meditations, Untimely Reflections, or even, I like this, Essays in Sham Smashing. So Nietzsche began writing these essays, and he actually only completed 4 of them. Of course, the 4 that we have are David Strauss, the confessor and writer, on the advantages and disadvantages of the use of history for life, Schopenhauer as educator, and Richard Wagner in Beirut. Nietzsche and his publisher, Nietzsche was having significant difficulties finding a publisher and had to go ultimately to Wagner to get help in publishing The Birth of Tragedy. So Wagner's publisher, E.W. Fritsch, he offers Nietzsche a contract, and Nietzsche enters in not only a contract for The Birth of Tragedy, but Nietzsche enters into this contract for 13 essays. Nietzsche finishes 4 of them, and then there's so much drama in the background in regard to the publisher and the publisher's financial situation that the relationship with Nietzsche and his publisher begins to deteriorate. At the same time, Nietzsche begins writing the Free Spirit Trilogy. The first of the Free Spirit Trilogy, of course, is Human All Too Human. And though there are conflicting accounts of the origin of Human All Too Human, Nietzsche had already begun dictating his books, because of his poor eyesight, to his friend Heinrich Koselleck, I forgot the umlaut, whom Nietzsche gave the pseudonym Peter Gast. And according to Koselleck, this book was originally to be part 6 of the Untimely Meditations. Nietzsche had plotted out the 13 essays, and there is some sense in which you can, if you would like, you could go back, look at Nietzsche's outline of those 13 essays, and then start to ask yourself, how does that outline relate to the rest of Nietzsche's work? In May of 1879, due to his continuing poor health, Nietzsche resigned from his university professorship. In 1881, we see the publication of Daybreak. This is also sometimes translated as Dawn, or Daybreak: Thoughts on the Prejudices of Morality. So it's during this time that Nietzsche becomes functionally blind. He had already been dictating his books to his friend because of his struggles with his eyesight, but at this point, the accounts in his letters suggest that he is functionally blind. Nietzsche's poems, Idols from Messina, were published in a monthly magazine, and they include the poems The Outlaw Prince, Song of the Goatherd, The Secret of the Night, and A Bird's Verdict. Now we enter into the third. So I have some more things to say about the Dawn, the second book of the Free Spirit Trilogy, but first we need to say a few things about the third book before it would make sense. So in 1882, we see the publication of the first edition of The Joyful Quest, or Die Frohliche Wissenschaft. The first edition of The Joyful Quest contains 4 chapters or books, and originally Nietzsche thought of this as his last book. After he had finished writing the first 3 books, or the first 3 parts of The Joyful Quest, he began to think of this work as the conclusion to his previous book, Dawn. So it's interesting to watch how Nietzsche, these books seem as though they're all separate entities, but if you look at the way that Nietzsche himself thought about these books, they have some very interesting relationships. We think of them as completely separate books, but Nietzsche saw them as, volume 2 in essence of an earlier book. So it's at this point that Nietzsche has his eureka moment. And I talk about this so much in 2 other episodes, the episode on the Eternal Return and the episode on Amor Fati, that I'm not going to go too far into it here. But the basic idea is that Nietzsche encountered Kierkegaard's idea of repetition through his correspondence with his friend George Brandes, who had been translating Kierkegaard. So not only did he share passages from Kierkegaard in translation in German, translated into German, but he also shared some of his commentary on Kierkegaard. So Nietzsche was aware of, at least especially, Kierkegaard's idea of repetition, which is enough. So this concludes the Free Spirit Trilogy, and it also concludes Nietzsche's early phase, the early phase of his writing. Now, we enter into the middle phase of Nietzsche's writing, and this is where we see Thus Spoke Zarathustra, or sometimes translated into English as Also Spoke Zarathustra, a book for everyone and no one. Now, Nietzsche wrote this, these are 4 books, again, or 4 parts, and Nietzsche wrote each one of the parts separately. Nietzsche claimed to have written each of the first 3 books of Thus Spoke Zarathustra in 10 days each. So what we're going to see is that there were a number of times in which Nietzsche had these frenzied writing experiences. He also claims that he wrote The Twilight of the Idols in 10 days. So the first book of Zarathustra was finished during the afternoon in January when Richard Wagner died. Zarathustra was born at the moment when Wagner died. Nietzsche becomes entangled in a lawsuit with his publisher, so things have deteriorated pretty significantly. And by the end of the 4 books of Zarathustra, after they've been published, Nietzsche needed to find a new publisher. So it's at this point that Nietzsche begins self-publishing. And we see the first book that's published here is Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude of a Philosophy of the Future. Nietzsche referred to what would later become Beyond Good and Evil as the companion piece or the second part of his 1881 book titled Dawn. Nietzsche later said of Beyond Good and Evil that it says the same things as were stated in Zarathustra, just in a different way. Nietzsche also expressed that Book 5 of The Joyful Quest may be thought of as the centerpiece for an additional part to be added to the second edition of Beyond Good and Evil. An excerpt from the following review, which appeared shortly after the publication of Beyond Good and Evil, is actually really wonderful to recount. So from J.V. Widmann, the title of the review was Nietzsche's Dangerous Book. Here's a block quote from the review. The stocks of dynamite, which were used in the building of the Gotthard Tunnel, were marked with a black flag, indicating deadly danger. Only in this sense do we talk about the new book by the philosopher Nietzsche as a dangerous book. In this way, we do not mean to suggest any hint of reproach against the author or his work. No more than the black flag is intended as a reproach to the explosives. And even less would it be our hope that by pointing out the dangerousness of his book, we might deliver up the lonely thinker to the ravens of the pulpit and the crows of the altar. Intellectual explosives, like the material sort, can serve a very useful purpose. It is not necessary that they be misused for criminal purposes. Only it is helpful that where material such as this is stored, that it be clearly marked. Here there is dynamite. Okay, so what we see then is that Nietzsche's middle phase is marked by Beyond Good and Evil, and then he also writes the fifth book to The Joyful Quest. So the second edition of The Joyful Quest appears, and lastly, toward the genealogy of morality, or on the genealogy of morals, as it's most often translated. And Nietzsche explicitly described On the Genealogy of Morals as an addition to Beyond Good and Evil. So this is a direct quote, an addition to the last published Beyond Good and Evil, which is meant as a supplement and clarification. This then ends the middle phase of Nietzsche's writing. The last phase of Nietzsche's writing then begins with The Case of Wagner, which was originally subtitled A Musician's Problem. Next, we see Nietzsche contra Wagner. Then we see Twilight of the Idols, or How to Philosophize with a Hammer. Two things to share about this. On the one hand, How to Philosophize with a Hammer is supposed to refer to a tuning fork, right? So the use of the hammer to make the sound. So what we're seeing here is not so much a hammer in terms of smashing things with a hammer, but that's often how it's interpreted. Also, it's interesting to see what the original title for Twilight of the Idols was, and that title was A Psychologist's Leisure. So, as I mentioned earlier, Nietzsche claimed that he wrote Twilight of the Idols in 10 days also. Next, we have The Antichrist, an attempt at a critique of Christianity. That was its original title. Nietzsche began referring to it as the first of 4 books comprising the Revaluation of All Values. Sometimes we hear that as the Transvaluation of All Values. But in either case, it's important to note that Nietzsche's book, The Antichrist, was originally referred to by Nietzsche in writing as the first of 4 books comprising the Revaluation of All Values. He later changed the title to The Antichrist, Revaluation of All Values, claiming that the book constituted the whole of the Revaluation of All Values, not just a quarter of it. So this is important because there are basically 3 positions in regard to this. One, that Nietzsche never wrote the Revaluation of All Values, even though he intended to write it. The other position is that the Antichrist constitutes the first book of 4 books that were to be the Revaluation of All Values. The last position, of course, is that the Antichrist is the Revaluation of All Values. I think those are the only real tenable positions. There's other folks would say that, well, if you go back across his other books, you can just put together the Revaluation of All Values. Some people have argued also that the key to the Revaluation of All Values is in the Will to Power, the posthumous notes that were published under the title The Will to Power. You can make up your mind for yourself, but these are the possible positions. So the problem, of course, being that Nietzsche lost his mind before the Antichrist could be published. And Nietzsche had scratched out the Revaluation subtitle. It's difficult to say precisely what it was that Nietzsche was thinking. And it's also difficult to say, did he scratch out the Revaluation subtitle because he wasn't himself, or because he was disturbed in some way? Lastly, then, Nietzsche's ecce homo, how one becomes what one is. And this was referred to by Nietzsche as his autobiography. So it makes sense to think of this as Nietzsche's autobiography. And then, as we already mentioned, the Will to Power. In sum, in regard to Nietzsche's canon, we can divide up his writings into the early phase, the middle phase, and the late phase. It's also helpful to see how Nietzsche thought of these books in terms of how they related to one another. Just to run through a few of the highlight points in regard to Nietzsche's canon. So the first is that Nietzsche thought that the first 3 parts of the Joyful Quest, that the first edition of the Joyful Quest was going to be the conclusion, or the second part, to his book, The Dawn. He encounters Kierkegaard's idea of repetition, and he also had thought that the Joyful Quest was going to be his last book. But after encountering this idea, he composes the Joyful Quest as a book unto itself. He then goes into his next phase of writing, in which he writes Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Thus Spoke Zarathustra was written in a frenzy. Again, he says that the first 3 books were written in 10 days each. Can you imagine writing the first 3 parts of Zarathustra in just 1 month? Beyond Good and Evil was originally conceived of and described by Nietzsche as a restatement in prose form, essentially, of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. That can be surprising to some people when they first hear that. Also, it's the case that on the genealogy of morals, or toward the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche thought of that book as the second part to an addendum, just to clarify Beyond Good and Evil. So that can also be quite surprising the first time that you hear it. Then lastly, in regard to this last phase of Nietzsche's writings, this question of the revaluation of all values, that's a question that just haunts Nietzsche's philosophy. But if we focus in on the idea and the details around Nietzsche's work, The Antichrist, its multiple subtitles, for example, then there is a sense in which that can help us make a decision in regard to, had Nietzsche actually ever constructed the revaluation of all values. So I hope that this episode was helpful. I had originally recorded this episode and included a lot of biographical information regarding Nietzsche and his publishers, but I felt as though that might be better placed in a kind of biography, so I'm going to leave that out for now. Thank you very much. Please do like, subscribe, and click the bell to be notified. Spread the word, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.